Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Melanie Zanona in Washington with breaking news. We have new details and new fallout from Saturday night's attempted assassination of President Trump at the White House Correspondents Dinner. After 31-year-old Cole Thomas Allen, armed with a shotgun, handgun, and knives, breached security in an attempt to target the president and other top government officials. The sound of multiple gunshots echoed through the dinner, forcing the president, the vice president, and other high-ranking government officials to take cover before being evacuated by their security details. The suspect was in federal court for the first time this afternoon. And moments ago, we heard from Acting Attorney General Todd Blanche, alongside FBI Director Kash Patel and U.S. Attorney Jeanine Pirro.
This man was a floor above the ballroom, with hundreds of federal agents between him and the President of the United States. The Department of Justice approaches incidents like this with urgency and clarity of purpose. Violence has no place in civic life.
There will be additional charges as this investigation continues to unfold. But make no mistake, this was an attempted assassination of the President of the United States, with the defendant making clear what his intent was. And that intent was to bring down as many of the high-ranking cabinet officials as he could.
In addition to being charged with attempted assassination of the president, Cole Thomas Allen also faces 2 counts of firearm-related offenses, including the discharge of a firearm. Authorities say he exchanged fire with law enforcement before being wrestled to the ground and detained. One Secret Service agent was shot, but was protected by a bulletproof vest and is expected to be okay. Authorities also say that minutes before the attack, the suspect sent his family notes apologizing for what he was going to do, criticizing the president without mentioning his name, and also writing about the lax security at the hotel. The president describing his experience of the harrowing incident on CBS's 60 Minutes last night, along with his interactions with members of his own security detail trying to protect him.
I wanted to see what was happening, and I wasn't making it that easy for him. I wanted to see what was going on. And by that time, we started to realize maybe it was a bad problem, different kind of a problem, bad one, and different than what would be normal noise from a ballroom, which you hear all the time. And I was surrounded by great people, and I probably made them act a little bit more slow. I said, wait a minute, let me see, wait a minute. So, you know, I'm telling guys.
Just at that moment where it looks like you go sort of down with the service, you were telling them to wait?
Well, I know what happened is then I started walking with them. I started walking, and they said, please go down on the floor. So I went down, and First Lady went down also, but we were asked to go down by the agents as I was walking. In other words,
they wanted you almost to crawl.
I was standing up, pretty much. I was standing up and then turned around the opposite direction and started pretty much walking out, pretty tall, a little bent over because I'm not looking to be standing too tall. And but I was walking out. It was about halfway there, and they said, please go down to the floor, please go down to the floor. So I dropped to the floor, so did the First Lady.
The incident marks the latest in a rash of politically motivated violence, which has included deadly attacks on members of both parties and multiple attempts on the president's life. NBC's Garrett Hake pressing the president about the recent spate of violence at the White House Saturday night after the incident.
There's been so much political violence, not just aimed at yourself, but at other members of Congress, state house speakers, you name it. Is that just the cost of doing business to do politics in America anymore?
Yeah, well,
what does that say about our country?
Too. Yeah, we're not the only country. You look at this great violence with all countries. I was talking to somebody from another country today, and they have numerous assassinations of political figures all over the world. You look at South America, it's like some of the numbers are just horrific. It's dangerous stuff, whether it's here or someplace else. No country is immune. No country.
We've got all angles of this story covered with NBC News national law enforcement and intelligence correspondent Tom Winter, NBC News legal affairs reporter Gary Grumbach, NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba, former U.S. Attorney and current NBC News legal analyst Carol Lam, and Evy Poumpouras, former Special Secret Service agent and now an NBC News law enforcement analyst. Thank you all so much for joining us. Tom, I do want to start with you. Just take us through these charges and what more we learned from the suspect's court appearance today.
Right. So it's just 3 counts so far. And it's important to note that this has been charged on complaint, meaning an FBI agent swears out an affidavit and then says the evidence that they've uncovered so far that would lead them to be able to charge the 3 counts you're looking at on screen. Count 1, that attempt to assassinate the president of the United States, that carries a sentence up to life in prison. Count 3, discharge of a firearm during a crime of violence. That's a mandatory minimum if there's a conviction of 10 years in prison. Included in this is a detailed timeline of the travels of Allen, the information as far as how he was able to get from California, where he lives, to Washington, D.C. by train. The fact that he was able to get a hotel room here at the Hilton Hotel, where you see him now on the ground, having been stripped of his clothing after being taken into custody. That purchase happens, or that reservation, I should say, happens on April 6th. The 21st, he travels L.A. to Chicago. He begins his journey from Chicago to Washington on the 23rd. And on the 24th, he arrives in D.C. That was Friday. This incident obviously happening on Saturday night, and he checks into the hotel. The U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, Janine Pirro, says there will be additional charges. She mentioned at the press conference, she says he knew that Trump was in the ballroom, and there's a reference to the fact that the event is televised. So I'd be curious to know if they've developed some evidence that he either had the TV on in his room to this event or was somehow streaming the coverage of it so that Allen knew when he would be, he being the president of the United States, in the ballroom. There's also a reference in the note. We've been reporting on it for the last couple of days, not quoting from it extensively because why give this person more publicity than they were seeking? But there is a line that says, administration officials, parentheses, not including Mr. Patel, of course he's the FBI director, they are targets, prioritized from highest ranking to lowest. So who's the highest ranking member of the Trump administration? The president of the United States, of course. 3 now, according to the Justice Department, both in the Biden administration and in this administration, 3 attempts of assassination against the president of the United States. 2 of those, of course, as a candidate. And obviously, this is all quite serious and in the backdrop of continued political threats in this country and targeted assassinations, both involving Minnesota lawmakers, the arson attack on Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro's residence, in the assassination of Charlie Kirk, just to name a few.
Yeah, the list goes on and on. Gary, prosecutors just unsealed the charging documents in the case. What more did we learn, and what happened in court today?
Yeah, so we learned a lot about exactly how he did what he did and what he had on him at the time. Prosecutors saying today in court that he had a 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. That is the one that apparently he did fire at least 1 shot from. He also had a .38 caliber semi-automatic pistol, 3 knives, and as the prosecutor said in court today, other dangerous paraphernalia. We don't exactly know exactly what else that will be, but that will certainly come out as this investigation and this case unfolds. Here in court, he walked in with a blue jumpsuit on, sat down, answered all of the questions from the judge as the judge read him his rights and read him the 3 charges against him that could be, if he is found guilty and if he is convicted here, he could spend the rest of his life behind bars because of that attempted assassination charge. And we also talked through exactly how exactly he ran through those magnometers, saying that the Secret Service officer was shot once in the chest. The officer was wearing a ballistic vest at the time. He has since been released from the hospital, and he's doing just fine. The officer then drew his service weapon and fired multiple times at Cole Allen, who fell to the ground but was not hit by any of those shots. So he was injured just by simply falling to the ground and then was apprehended from that point. So an interesting play-by-play of exactly what happened in the lobby of the ballroom.
And Carol, we just heard about those charges, but talk to me about what kind of sentences are actually associated with those charges.
Yeah, I think Tom was exactly right in the way he recapped that the most serious charge, of course, targeting the assassination of the president of the United States, because there was no actual death in the case. The death penalty is off the table, but it does carry a potential life sentence. And then there's the discharge of a firearm during the crime of violence that carries a minimum mandatory 10 years enhancement to the sentence that you would get on count one, which is the attempted assassination. And then there's the transportation of the firearms across state lines, which carries at least a 5-year sentence. So serious charges with a sentence enhancement as well. So those are the potential charges.
Monica, I want to turn to you over at the White House. What are we hearing from the White House, and how is the president reacting to these latest charges?
Well, Mel, the White House did have a press briefing earlier today ahead of the DOJ presser. And Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, was actually supposed to be on maternity leave already. She indicated on Friday that that was going to be her last day working. She, of course, was at the dinner and then was supposed to go off and have her next baby. But she said she wanted to come today and brief reporters and take questions, given the circumstances, given the fact that she was there, and wanted the president, she says, wanted her to be able to come forward and share some additional information. So we know that they wanted to get out and do that before the DOJ presser, before we learned all the details about these specific charges. And the president, from what I can tell, I'm checking my phone, has actually been weighing in on other matters on True Social. He's been talking about different renovation projects and other news stories, but hasn't specifically talked about this beyond his comments last night on 60 Minutes and what he has been generally talking about and what he said from that very same lectern in the briefing room on Saturday night, just a couple of hours after he was rushed from that stage, which is that he is applauding law enforcement, their efforts overall. He's saying that they acted quite quickly in order to neutralize the suspect. But of course, now raising these larger legitimate questions about the security footprint. So this is a White House right now that is letting the sort of legal process play out on that lane. And then in their own lane, they are making this about what this could mean for future events and a security review that is starting to get underway, that the White House will have to kind of look at holistically whether they are going to change anything in light of this event. The president has been a little bit critical of the Washington Hilton as a venue itself, saying that maybe there were some vulnerabilities, and he's trying to use that to try to make the pitch for his $400 million ballroom project, but that is facing some legal hurdles. So you're hearing a lot of different messages from the administration. But Caroline Leavitt, who was also working around the Butler, Pennsylvania assassination attempt in 2024, was making the point today that this is the now third assassination attempt against the president in the last couple of years. And they are really trying to project to the American people and to the public that they say the president is going to continue to appear at events, is going to continue to carry on. But behind the scenes, we know that there are discussions about what that actually looks like.
Yeah, no doubt that's going to be a huge storyline in the days ahead. Gary, Jeanine Pirro said that additional charges are likely to come in this case. Do we have any sense of when that might happen?
So this is all part of the investigative process, right? They are literally only about 48 hours removed from when this incident actually happened. And look at what they've done already. They've already searched the individual's house in California. They know he came from California via train through Chicago and then over here to D.C. They know when he checked in. They've searched his room. They've searched the items that were certainly on his person at the time. And so they're going to take all of that information and look through it and try to find a motive here. Yes, we have certainly that document, that email that was sent to individuals that he was related to about exactly sort of what his intents could be, but they're going to look into more of that, talk to those individuals that he sent that to. What did mom and dad know? What did any significant others perhaps know about the situation? And further charges could come based off those conversations.
Carol, one thing the suspect was not charged with was assaulting a federal officer, at least not yet. Are you surprised by that?
I am a little surprised by that, given that that was the initial reaction of the Justice Department. Was, you know, there seemed to be no question that the Secret Service agent was shot. And what this suggests to me, because both the complaint and the affidavit attached to the complaint were a little bit ambiguous about what actually happened there. What that tells me is that Jeanine Pirro's office probably wants to take a little more time to look at the ballistics and see what actually happened there. Did the discharge of the firearm actually occur from his gun or perhaps a law enforcement gun? It doesn't matter legally, because if there's a discharge of a firearm during these events that he caused by his actions, he can be held responsible for the discharge. But I think we have to wait and see what actually happens, because as you read the complaint today, there's no actual tie of the charges to the actual injury suffered by the Secret Service agent.
And Tom, I know you referenced the writings earlier from the gunman. What are we learning from those writings? And do investigators think anything he posted publicly could have been perceived as a potential red flag?
Well, as far as the public postings, there's nothing that comes out that indicates some sort of an overt threat. I mean, you are entitled to say all sorts of things that most people, I think, would deem to be horrible about a whole variety of topics from a whole bunch of different perspectives. But we have the First Amendment in this country, and people have a right to that free speech. Where it becomes a problem from a law enforcement perspective is when we move from speech into threat. That crosses a threshold for which things can be prosecuted. Look, we're still going through the social media of this individual. There are undoubtedly accounts that we might not be, that we can't see or have since been taken down. As I sit here at 4:16 Eastern Time on Monday afternoon, there's nothing that comes across as an overt threat that the FBI or another law enforcement agency could have used to make an arrest ahead of time. As far as the writings go, what are we learning from that other than everything? I mean, I think it's very clear the individual's intentions here. There's really no ambiguity, and so that's something that clearly forms the foundation and most of the walls of this criminal complaint.
Yeah, Carol, on that subject, how important do you think these writings will be when it comes to this case?
Yeah, I mean, it would take a pretty creative defense attorney to come up with a very effective defense in this case. And to the extent, this is obviously a very intelligent individual, and to the extent that these writings are out there, they pretty much do away with a lot of what you might, as a defense attorney, hope to say, for example, an insanity defense or something like that. And it certainly doesn't help his case that he signs it as your friendly, federal assassin. There seems to be, he doesn't leave a lot of room for a great defense here. There's, the fact that he didn't get close to the ballroom in the sense that it was on a different floor, perhaps opens the door a little bit to some kind of defense. But, it's to Tom's point, it's a pretty clear-cut case here.
Evy, I want to bring you into this conversation, especially on the security aspect of this. There are a lot of questions about the lack of security, but the president has said that the protocols worked as they should have. Do you see this as a success from the Secret Service perspective?
So let's clarify when we say lack of security. The security plan worked. The way it's designed is you create a perimeter. You figure out where your protectee of the President of the United States is going to be, and you build a security around it. Now, I know people are talking about it's a hotel, it's active, people are moving in and out. I've done dozens of hotels. I've never been able to shut down a hotel. So what we're looking at is the placement of the magnet tunnels.
Evy, I need to pause this conversation for a moment for a very different kind of breaking news. You're looking at some live pictures of King Charles and Queen Camilla arriving at the White House right now. It's their first official trip to the U.S. with Charles as the reigning monarch, and it's also the first state visit by a British monarch since Charles' mother, Queen Elizabeth, in 2007. Let's listen in. This afternoon, the King and Queen are expected to have tea and take a tour of the White House, beehives with the President and the First Lady, followed by a garden party event at the British Embassy. This White House visit is the first stop on the King and Queen's high-profile 4-day state visit celebrating 250 years of American independence, with a goal of reinforcing the bond between the two countries. Tomorrow, the King will deliver a joint address to Congress and attend a state dinner at the White House. Monica, I'm going to turn back to the conversation that we were having before about these security measures. You alluded to this earlier. The White House is set to talk about some of these security measures later this week. What is the White House saying about what changes potentially could be made?
Yeah, and it's interesting, Mel, because we obviously had some of these discussions that we reported on in 2024 in the summer after the Butler assassination attempt, when it was then candidate Donald Trump, but still he was under Secret Service protection since he had been a former president at that point. And so you did see some shifts to how they conducted some outdoor events. There was a pause in those kinds of events, and then they did change some of those things that were apparent to us and that we were able to report on. But behind the scenes, there are always adjustments that can be made that aren't necessarily talked about or revealed because they would potentially endanger the security protocol. So what's going to happen this week is the White House Chief of Staff, Susie Wiles, is going to meet with the head of the U.S. Secret Service and DHS leadership to assess what happened over the weekend. And we should be clear that according to the White House, the president is standing with the current leadership, that he does feel that the way that all of this was done in response was handled appropriately. At least that is how they are describing it today. So they stand by how it was dealt with this attempted attack, but they do want to be sure to huddle together and make a determination about whether future events need to have some adjustment. So it's too soon to say what that might look like. We know, for instance, over these next couple of days in the state visit with King Charles and Queen Camilla that you were just referencing, that's going on as planned. It doesn't seem like they're making adjustments to that yet. But again, it may not be entirely clear, or we may not know until after the fact. But there are some very large events that the president is slated to be a part of over the last many months. He has attended about a dozen sporting events. He has gone to very high profile events with thousands and thousands of people at different kinds of venues and stadiums. And so the question is that something that's going to continue, or will there be a pause on that? Will there be any kind of rethinking of his participation or the way that he's going to be involved in some of those America 250 events that are scheduled to take place around the 4th of July, around celebrating America's independence? That is what they're going to start to review. And it sounds like there will be one meeting this week. And of course, that will continue because there will need to be more of those. No.
And Evy, I want to bring you back into this conversation. Talk to me about how security at these types of events, like the White House Correspondents Dinner, typically work. And given just how many people were in the line of succession that were in attendance, do you think that that should have been given a higher security designation in your view?
This event's been going on for years, so they're following the protocol, the security protocol that they typically had. When you do a side advance, it's called a side advance as an agent, especially if it's been done before. They do hand you the paperwork and say, hey, this is what's been done before. It seems to work well. And then you look at that blueprint. There are times where I've done side advances and I have pushed back and said, look, I understand this was done this way before, but I don't think this is going to work. And I think in the environment that we're in, we've had 3 assassination attempts. We are looking at a different type of protection plan here that needs to come into place. So it's pushing out the security perimeter. That magnetometer checkpoint, it's really the first line of defense. The question that's being raised is it too close? Do you want a tighter perimeter, or do you want to push it out? Now, if you push it out, and there was discussion about how the individual actually went down to the event, right? He used one of the stairwells internally so nobody would see him. He was undetected, came down, popped out outside the magnetometers. But then when you watch the video, you do see him cruise through super fast, right? So that's an issue. Is that too close? Do I want more manpower in these stairwells? And I would push back and say, should you even be doing an event like this in a hotel? If you have so many protectees, and all these protectees, cabinet members, keep in mind they're being protected by different groups. Secretary Rubio, Department of State. You know, HHS, Kennedy, he's probably got marshals. Your members of Congress, the Speaker, Capitol Police. So you do have a large amount of people in that room, and that does bring concern. The other thing, too, that nobody's really talking about is the attendees. You're responsible for all human life. So I'm not just responsible for the president, the vice president, these cabinet members and other protectees. What about the 2,600 plus people in there? I have to make sure that they're okay. They are going to where the threat is. The threat is these protectees. So having a plan in place. Are they safe? Can I get them out of the exit? What if I have a biochemical attack? And he used weapons. So now, what if he didn't use a weapon? So we bring in the concept of an IED, any type of explosive device. So then where does my security perimeter go? He checked in and had a room. Can you clear these rooms? Now you're talking about Fourth Amendment right issues. Do I legally, as an agent, have the ability to go clear hotel rooms to look at individuals? So I would suspect that when they're having these closed door talks right now, They should be changing the way they do things. Secret Service has always been an agency that's never liked to intervene, never liked to say no. And in fact, it was always told, like, we don't say no, we make it work. And I suspect that that's not gonna work anymore. I think no should be more prevalent. It should be, we can't do this. This is why we shouldn't do this. This is what we encourage. Now, is your protectee going to get more into that bubble, right? He's a public figure. You want him out there shaking hands, being in these photos. You know, I would get pushed back a lot with like, hey, we want him exposed. And as an individual that puts a security plan together, I would say, well, I don't want him exposed because I can't guarantee his safety. And so what is protection going to look like in the future? And I think it's really significantly going to change.
Well, Evy, to your exact point, after the first two assassination attempts of President Donald Trump in Pennsylvania and Florida, the acting head of the Secret Service called for a paradigm shift in how the agency protects the president. So do you think we've seen that shift?
One of the things I would say you may have and you may not. One of the reasons I say you may not, it seems as though, and again, I don't have confirmation, the security plan used for this specific event was one that's been used before. That's the concern there. And it requires a specific type of agent to go an event, and I've had it, and push back. And I've had events where I've gone to, actually I had an event, President Barack Obama, where he went to a hotel resort, people moving in and out. I couldn't shut the hotel down. They gave me the site survey from the individual, the agent that did it before me. And it's like, hey, this person did it, not a heavy lift. And when I look through it and I actually walk the perimeter, for me, I was like, I can't secure this. I don't think this is done well. So when I go back and I give inflated numbers, I want more resources, I want more tactical teams, they're looking at me like, where are you coming up with these numbers when this other person secured it with these other numbers? And so I had to make the argument, and it was a lot of pushback. He secured it. I think we were very fortunate nothing happened. If you truly want me to secure it, this is what I need. So it is a negotiation process. You have to have the ability to go there and really advocate and say, no, I'm not going to do it with this. This is what I need. Now, if you want to give me 5 agents, I'll secure it with 5. But for me to say this is a safe venue, this is what I need. So I do suspect that because sometimes with some of these events, it's been done before, here's our plan, I don't think these plans are working anymore. And I've never seen it, and I've worked under multiple administrations. I have never experienced the level of threats that I've seen with this president and this administration, as opposed to all the other protectees I've seen before. It truly is astonishing.
Evy, thank you so much for that just fascinating and important perspective. My thanks to Monica, Tom, Gary, and Carol as well. In the wake of Saturday's assassination attempt, White House Press Secretary Carol Lam today blasted Democrats while also blaming the left for the rise in political violence. Take a listen.
The left-wing cult of hatred against the president and all of those who support him and work for him has gotten multiple people hurt and killed, and it almost did so again this weekend. When you read the manifesto of this shooter, ask yourselves, how different is the rhetoric from this almost assassin than what you read on social media and hear in various forums every single day? The answer, if you're being honest with yourself, is that there is no difference at all.
Joining me now is Cynthia Miller-Idriss, Director of the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab at American University. I want to start with what we just heard from the press secretary, blaming a left-wing cult of hatred for the shooting. Are we seeing an uptick in political extremism on the left of the political spectrum? And what are we seeing in terms of on the right side of the political spectrum?
Yeah, we have definitely seen an uptick in political violence across the spectrum, across the ideological spectrum, and across the sort of non-ideological spectrum, I would say, meaning political violence that's motivated by grievances and sort of personality challenges related to anger directed at political leaders or at issues or at even the CEO, the healthcare CEO in New York City. So, and we're seeing upticks in rhetoric across the board that not only, can facilitate further anger toward elected officials, but also doesn't condemn the violence, especially when it happens to the other side or from your own sort of side. So I think one of the first things we have to see is condemnation of the violence across the board in a bipartisan way. And we also have to look at issues of not just protection of our leaders, but prevention of violence, which I hope that we can talk about as well.
And based on what we know, at least so far, does the suspect fit sort of the typical profile of what you would consider a violent extremist?
I think we're not seeing the same kind of typical profile over the last 3, 4, or 5 years compared to what we had seen before. So we're seeing less and less violence that's motivated by traditional ideologies, far left or far right or Islamist, and much more a mix of grievances, personal complaints, and then a kind of pursuit of meaning and belonging and a desire to have some sort of impact on the world, almost in grandiose ways, right? Thinking that they might be a martyr for a cause. And this certainly fits that type of profile in terms of his writing, in terms of feeling like he's almost speaking from a place of despair about not feeling like he's seeing the world that he wants, and then somehow turning that into mobilization to violence. That's different than feeling like there's an ideology that you're trying to achieve. Here, this is a really despairing kind of vision, almost one of hopelessness is the kind of tone of his writing.
And the press secretary also referenced the role of social media. There was actually a Gallup poll from last year that found people who agree it is sometimes okay to use violence to achieve a political goal are more likely to use social media multiple hours a day. What do you make of those numbers?
Yeah, we have definitely seen the role of social media in proliferating conspiracy theories, false flag claims, even about this attack almost immediately, and in fomenting kind of violence and the resulting support for violence and the use of violence as a sort of acceptable means to an end, increasing across the political spectrum. But we also see that people don't want to live this way. And so one of the things I find when I speak to high school students, to parents, to everyone in communities, is that they don't want their children to be in violent situations. They don't want to be in violent situations themselves across the spectrum. And so I think that's really important to realize.
And Cynthia, real quickly here, I want to talk about what brings an individual from online to offline. And is it reasonable to expect law enforcement to investigate anyone else who may have made the same kind of remarks online?
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think it's an impossible ask to think that law enforcement can be perfect every time. In fact, the IRA, when they had a failed assassination attempt against a British member of the royal family, once said, you know, that's okay. They have to get it right every time. We only have to get it right once. And so the idea that we can be safer by just continuing to increase our security perimeters or building bigger fences, I think is a false, is really a false claim here. We have to prevent people from seeing that their individual grievances should be mobilized into violent action by helping them off-ramp earlier, by educating communities about warning signs and investing in kind of primary prevention that helps them create digital media literacy to reject propaganda, manipulation, and other harmful things that provably move grievances to violence.
As a researcher, how do you draw attention to rising political violence on either side of the aisle without suggesting that people are inherently violent based on political affiliation?
I think, you know, we are seeing a society that's more violent. We have something like a 400% increase in road rage incidents. We've had increases in domestic violence. We have increases in political violence. So people are feeling hopeless and scared for a reason. But I also know that people don't believe that this is the way we have to live, and they don't want to live this way. So we also point to what you can do provably, which is increase people's sense of belonging, efficacy, their sense of agency, their sense of purpose, meaning, community, social cohesion. All of these things provably have, in an evidence-based way from decades of public health research on violence prevention, shown that you can create safer communities through education and prevention work, and not just by securitizing ourselves further. You can only build the castle walls so high. And I don't think any of us want to live that way.
No doubt. Cynthia, thank you so much for bringing us your important expertise.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.